Brad, can I tell you my two least favorite sports to be a parent at?
Your two least favorite?
I might get some hate mail for this, but I got to tell you, being a parent at a cross-country event or being a parent at a track and field event, it is arguably the most boring thing we have to do as a parent.
Oh, my goodness.
Okay, let's start with cross-country, because it's like, okay, everybody's up at the starting line. Bang! Good luck. Hey, Greg! Good job, good job, good job. Hey! And then 48 minutes later, here they come. You can do it, buddy. Come on, you got this. An hour and a half later. And in the meantime, you're making small talk with parents that you barely know. And you're like, this sure is a beautiful day out here.
Oh, yeah. And what do you do after it's a beautiful day? Do you know of a good place to get coffee? And, any school gossip, did you hear about the principal? And then you're out. There's nothing to talk about with these people.
Yeah. Which I guess is better than track and field. So my experience, and maybe this is different in Philly, but my experience with track and field is, it's like, all right, the track and field is going to be at such and such high school, and everybody goes to that high school. Yeah. And in my case, there's like 48 schools there. And you have to wait 4 to 368 hours for your child's running event to happen, right?
Yeah.
So you're waiting for an interminable amount of time. Yeah. There is zero shade at a track and field event, Brad, because it's all metal, what do you call them? Bleachers. There's no trees on the infield, obviously. There's no trees around the track. Maybe if you're lucky, there's some trees back where they sell the 4-week-old hot dogs, but there's no
why
shade.
They call them bleachers is because by the time you're done sitting out there, your bones have been bleached in the sun.
But then, okay, so track, you're waiting for 4 to 5 hours. It's like, now up, there's like 40 different delineations of groupings. You finally get to your kid, they're running, and it's like, all right, bang! 4 seconds of excitement, and then it's another 3 hours until their next event. You're like, wait, shot put doesn't go until 9 p.m.? What happened?
Yeah.
Why am I waiting this long?
Why am I wasting my entire day? And meanwhile, your kid is there. You can't not show up for your kid. You gotta be there. I used to take sketchbooks. I used to take a laptop. I used to take anything to these events just to use some of the time a little bit. But oh my goodness, I'm glad my kids are quickly aging out of that.
Yeah, I mean, I find myself turning to the dad next to me going, a good place to get coffee? And he's like, you've asked that 6 times already.
Yeah, next time just bring your own coffee and bring one for me.
And on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody. Welcome to ComicLab, the show about waiting 4 hours and then having 4 seconds of excitement as your kid runs a 100-meter dash and making comics.
And I'm not going to try and follow that, making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the cartoonist of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal Dave Kellett, happy to wait for him. I'm also the cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and co-director of Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, bang, and they're off. Dave, let's talk comics.
Listen, it's that kind of improv that makes Brad Geiger a star, everybody. A star.
That's right. Don't you forget it.
Before we jump into the comics this week, I actually have a special announcement that I want to make to everybody because I just listened to the files and they are a dang delight. Last week, Brad and I recorded 2 bonus shows that are going out only to patrons of patreon.com/comiclab. Both of which Brad and I fired up the mics. Brad had some scotch. I had some wine. There's Drunk Comic Lab and Drunker Comic Lab. Yeah. The first hour is a dang delight. The second hour is an even more delight. And I got to tell you, join us by Thanksgiving. It's going to be amazing. You're going to want to see these 2 shows or hear these 2 shows.
You're going to want to join us at the $5 level. These are going to go out in lieu of ProTips for those 2 Tuesdays. So on November 28th, that's a Tuesday. The first one's going out, and on December 5th, that's the second one is going out. But to be able to see them, you're going to need to be at that $5 level so that you get that ProTips level.
Absolutely. And this is a show you already know you love, and you already know you're getting value out of it and you're laughing at it. So why not jump in? Honest to God, I was listening to these files, Brad, as I was driving to a track meet, to a cross-country meet, and I was weeping. At one point, you cut me down so badly that I driving was weeping in laughter. I was like, God damn, Brad is funny on when he's got a few in him. You were eviscerating me on this show.
Well, I'm a mean drunk, but at least I'm a funny mean drunk.
It was great. No, I loved it. So anyway, join us over at patreon.com/ComicLab. You're going to want to do it by Thanksgiving, and you're going to get 2 bonus shows. You get them every week, but now they're going to be 2 hour-long shows. Drunk Comic Lab and Drunker Comic Lab, both of which, and I'm not kidding about this, are 2 of the funniest things we have ever recorded. And that is not hyperbole. I guarantee it is 2 of the funniest things we have ever recorded.
It was literally, we were just going to set out to do a 1-hour show and then split them up as 2 half-hour pro tips. And we got to the end of the first hour without even realizing we had done it. And I'm like, screw it. Do you want to do another hour? And Dave's like, yes. So we filled our glasses again and did another hour. So it's 2 hours of drunken tomfoolery. It's a lot of fun. We go into some stories from conventions past. And
we did.
A lot of stories from webcomics history. And here's a little teaser. I'm just going to tickle you a little bit with this one. Making some plans for, do we want to say potential plans for a tour coming up? Maybe.
Oh, yeah. I suppose
that's all I'm going to say.
Sure.
That's all I'm going to say. But we did do a little bit of planning as well. So if you want to know what's going on, you're going to have to be there at that Pro Tips level. And you're going to get it in 2 consecutive Tuesdays of tomfoolery. Just right after Turkey Day, 2 Tuesdays of tomfoolery. You can't beat that for Stan Lee alliteration.
I didn't see where you were going with that, but you landed that Stan Lee play. That was great.
I saw those T's lining right up.
All right, well, let me jump us right into our first question, Brad, over at patreon.com/ComicLab, which everyone will join us on Thanksgiving. This comes in from Chris, and Chris writes, Brad and Dave, do you have any opinion on the more parasocial elements that would inspire someone to become a Patreon patron, wherein access to the artists themselves is part of the exclusive content, either through behind-the-scenes photos, more private details, etc. So, Brad, that comes in from Chris. And first, for those that might not be familiar with the term parasocial, Brad, do you want to explain what a parasocial relationship is on the basic level?
A parasocial relationship happens an awful lot on social media when somebody feels like they've got a relationship with you that doesn't actually exist. They feel like they're your friend. They feel like they're a confidant. They feel like they're closer to you than they actually are, because obviously, social media relationships form, and people, again, they think that they're a part of your family almost, or part of your friend group, when really they're just somebody you're responding to on social media. Right. And parasocial media friendships can be very difficult to navigate, and it almost and you can tell me, Dave, if I'm being unfair here, but it sounds like this person wants to, and I'm just going to say it, exploit those parasocial relationships to further their Patreon. And and again, I don't know whether I'm being fair there, so I'm going to say that right off the bat, but I want to warn you against that. In other words, parasocial relationships are something that happen as a result of social media and crowdfunding like Patreon, but at no time should it be something that you are trying to purposefully create. It's something, in other words, you know how people say it's a feature, not a bug? Well, this one is just the opposite. It's a bug, not a feature. It's something that you want to treat this very, very carefully. Because parasocial relationships do come up, but I don't think that you should be trying to exploit them to make your Patreon go higher. You know, for financial gain, I don't think you should be exploiting a parasocial relationship. And I will also say, as we're going to discuss in a moment, that involves walking a fine line.
Yeah, fine line is the right question. Is the right way to say it there, because like Brad said, a parasocial relationship is a one-way communication that's being imagined as a two-way communication. Yes. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's Brad being his delightful self, sharing his delightful work, sharing his delightful insights, and then someone somewhere interpreting that as friendship. And in an increasingly lonely world where we all don't socialize as much as we used to, you know, there's that book, Bowling for One or Bowling Alone in America, you know, because people don't go to church groups anymore. People don't join bowling. They don't join Rotary clubs anymore. So we don't have a social network like we used to have. And so people are oftentimes alone. And what happens is these social networks, these artificial social networks, start to replace genuine real world friendships. And so people imagine themselves, I'm a friend of Brad, or Brad is in my life. I know everything about Brad.
Yeah.
And what's funny about that is 99% of the time, maybe even more than 99% of the time, it would be fine if someone saw Brad at a comic convention and they're frankly in a little bit more parasocial relationship than you would think they should be in. They still will react and act like a normal human being. It's the 1% that it gets really creepy real quick, and frankly, sometimes can get dangerous.
Yeah.
That I will side with Brad on here. I don't know that it's something you want to lean into. I find, Brad, it tends to be younger artists who have not yet experienced, I don't know how to say it, the sting of how this can go wrong.
Yeah.
That lean into it. And as an older artist, I'm like, maybe don't share so much of the details of the this and the that. You know, I become like an old grandmother. I realize I just sounded like, but it's kind of true in the sense that you can share everything about your work, share everything about the process of your work. No one needs to know about your mom's cancer scare or how your relationship is going or past lovers you've had. You know, like none of that needs to be. I don't know. It's there is enough danger in the world that you don't need to share that, and you don't need to lean into sharing that kind of stuff.
Yeah. And here's what I mean when I say it means that you need to walk a fine line, because of course the parasocial aspect of Patreon is something that makes it somewhat powerful, right? In other words, I'm granting a certain amount of behind the scenes access when I'm doing my posts on Patreon, but that doesn't mean necessarily photos of my kids or photos of my personal life. I'll post a sketch of a comic page that I'm working on, right? And that's behind the scenes. But to share private details about my life, that's a personal choice that everybody makes, where exactly to draw the line. And I'll just use Dave and I as an example. When it came to our kids, right? Dave absolutely drew a line. No mention, right? It just isn't a thing. Me, I'd mention my kids. I when they were young, I had code names for them. When they were older and knew enough that I could be trusted, that somebody isn't going to come up and pull the wool over their eyes, I would use their names. But we both drew different lines, but neither one of us ever offered private details about their lives as an exchange for Patreon. Right. That's what I mean. It's a bug, not a feature. Those things are going to happen. And by the way, they've happened to both of us, Dave, where one of our readers assumed a much closer connection with us than actually existed. And that caused hurt feelings. It caused problems. It can really be bad. I listen, I'm going to speak to the question asker directly right now. And again, we might be reading it wrong. I got to give you the benefit of the doubt, but instead of trying to look for ways to game parasocial relationships for your Patreon, I want to encourage you to do something else. How about you do a good comic? How about you do a comic that somebody wants to read, wants to interact with? How about you focus really on the quality of your work and not try to game the system with all this? Because here's the thing. When I see something like that, my concern with you is that you don't have enough self-confidence. Because really at the root of that is, well, I don't think I'm good enough. I don't think my comic is good enough. And so I've got to do something extra in order to be competitive. And maybe that means granting access to my private life. And I'm going to tell you as a friend, as somebody one-on-one, I don't know you, but I know this about you. If you focus on doing a good comic and you really put your energies there, you are good enough. You can do this. You can make a comic that people want to interact with, and you're not going to need to exploit parasocial relationships to make your Patreon successful. You have it. You can do it. Focus on the work. That's my message to you. Focus on the work. You can do it. You are good enough. You might need practice. You might need work. It might not be happening for you today or tomorrow, but it can happen. But focus on your comic. Do that comic so good that that's what they want to interact with, and leave all this parasocial stuff out.
And I know I sound like an armchair psychologist when I try to equate this with loneliness, but I do think that loneliness is an epidemic, and I do think that modern society breeds a lot of loneliness. And whenever I see a cartoonist leaning into parasocial relationships or sharing in a parasocial way, I can feel behind the post their own loneliness, if that makes sense, Brad. I can feel it. Like, it's like, no, you need someone in your life to be able to share XYZ with. Don't share that online, you know? And so if you feel an inclination for a little bit of a peek behind the rest of your life, here is my advice to you. Make it a peek of your hobbies and not of you. So make it a peek about your woodworking, your gardening, your knitting, your quilt making. Do you know what I mean, Brad? Like, you can make it a peek about what you do for other hobbies and stuff like that, but don't bring your relationships into it. Don't bring the people of your life into it. By the way, some of whom might not even ask or want to be revealed. Because I feel like save some stuff for you and for the people in your life. You want a delineation of this is public, this is private. Otherwise, you're just walking into tricky ground. I don't know a better way to say it other than for your own mental health and for your own safety. And honestly, I think safety is the right word there. I think that you can very easily overshare in a way that you will eventually come to regret.
Yeah. And again, I'm just going to say it again. Focus on the work. That's where you're going to get the best return on investment. Dave, we've got another question from our $5 level Patreon backers. This one coming in from J Lark, and it says, what do you make of the fact that more streaming services are introducing paid plans that include ads? And I think he's talking about like Netflix and Hulu and stuff like that. Are ads making a comeback as a viable revenue stream? What would it take to make you consider re-adding third-party ads onto your comic website instead of just in-house ads? Dave Kellett, Netflix, Hulu, Disney, a lot of them are making the pivot towards ads. So that means that we should too, right?
No, the short answer is no. And God, I hope we do not return to a world where we have to put our ads back on. But so I think, and Brad said this best many shows ago, is that you have to know what business you're in, right, Brad? And this is the right way to look at this. Is know what business you're in. That streaming model is not our business model. And in fact, it's a broken business model for most people, even Netflix, who seems to have figured out the best. But if you look at their numbers, they took a perfectly good, in fact, super lucrative traditional TV business model, and they broke it because basically Netflix was eating their lunch, so they had to chase that dragon. But anyway, they broke the traditional network / syndication model, which was a cash cow. And everyone went to streaming, and now everyone's like, oh shit, wait, there's no money in this. and so they're all losing cash. Thankfully, Amazon and Apple have just piles of cash that they're sitting on, so they'll be fine. But Disney's like, yay. Turns out it's really expensive to produce a lot of Star Wars shows. And so so anyway, so they're all, Netflix included, which was the originator of all this, looking into ads. But that doesn't mean that has anything to do with our business model, Brad. And you said it best. Why don't you take that whole line that this is not your business model? This isn't your business.
Yeah, well, we were talking about it before the show. This is not your business. And not only that, I've really, and this has come up a few times on the show, we've got to come up with a title or a word for it, right? This phenomenon where you say, oh, Netflix is doing this, so I should do it. And you can see people making the similar mistake. In fact, I've made the same mistake when I was just starting out. And you know, I was looking at how Marvel Comics would price their graphic novel. right? They priced it at a certain rate. So when I made a graphic novel, I based my business decision on how to price that graphic novel on what Marvel's was, not taking into account that Marvel's had one set of unit costs and I had a completely different unit cost. The upshot was when I listed it in Diamond for distribution, instead of making money, I actually had to spend money. I had to spend $300, which should have been $300 profit. I had to spend I had to pay bookstores and comic shops to take my comic because I hadn't done, I didn't realize whose business I was in. I was doing business like I was Marvel Comics. It's even worse to look at Netflix. Netflix, I got news for you. Netflix has nothing to do with webcomics. And I shouldn't have to explain that to you. So to look at Netflix and say, it's as dangerous as saying, well, Ford Motor Company is doing XYZ, so I should do XYZ. Hey, listen, you got nothing to do with making cars. Focus on what your business is.
Right.
I think sometimes when we say put your head on a swivel, sometimes it's easy to swivel so much that it falls off your shoulders.
Yeah, that's true.
This is not having your head on a swivel.
Right.
This is and we're joking around about it, but I'm deathly serious. If you allow yourself to make business decisions like this, you're going to finally make one that's so bad it's going to take you out of business for good.
I mean, you had asked before, what do we call this kind of phenomenon? And I a little bit feel like this is akin to cargo culting business decisions. Like, this big, successful Fortune 500 company, which frankly, I don't quite understand all the machinations of. Much like a World War II plane flying over my island, I don't quite understand this, but I'm going to try to mimic what it can do. So much like a cargo cult, they would produce wooden statues of what they thought a plane was to sort of replicate the power of the gods. That you're trying to replicate what Netflix is doing. First of all, you don't even know if Netflix is making the right choice in putting ads on. It's very possible they're making the wrong choice even for them, but they're definitely making the wrong choice for you because you are not in that same business. It's frankly, Brad, the exact same thinking that we say every year when people are like, guys, what are you doing for free comic book day? And we always have to say, we are not in the business of supporting, promoting, or doing anything with Free Comic Book Day because that's not our business. Our business is not comic book shops. And frankly, that whole idea of Free Comic Book Day is meant to support the ecosystem of a dying comic book shop business, of which my business relies on not at all. So why would I spend thousands, if not tens of thousands, to produce a volume of free comic books that end up promoting or serving my business not at all, but serves the foot traffic of a comic book shop for that one day, And
the best possible scenario is somebody discovers your comic and then wants to go back to that comic shop and buy it. And that assumes you've got, I know people that are doing Free Comic Book Day, Dave. They don't have comics in the comic shop, or if they do, it's on consignment. Where they walked in with 5 copies of their book and the shop owner said, I'll take it on consignment, which means that you get paid if the book sells. Otherwise, it just sits there. And then you've got to check in every month or so saying, did it sell yet? No. Did it sell yet? No.
Exactly.
Did it sell? Consignment is the big, that kind of consignment is the biggest loser deal, and yet there's because people want to see their book on the shelf for the validation it gets them, they do it. But then somehow you're supposed to take that as a good thing. You got a free comic book day, getting somebody to go to the comic shop. It's much better that they buy that directly from you, the way a web comic is set up to do. It's much better if they buy that through the means that you've already got set up. Unless you're doing really brisk business at a comic shop, there's no reason to be doing Free Comic Book Day. And like Dave said, it all comes down to knowing what business you're in and knowing what business that you're not in.
Yeah, and maybe, so just to put a capstone on it, the business that we're in is giving away a huge percentage of our art for free in order to catch people's eyes so that become a casual reader, so that the casual reader becomes a heavy reader, so that the heavy reader becomes a fan, and ideally a percentage of the fans become supportive on Patreon, become supportive on Kickstarter, become supportive of our books, our tchotchkes, our this and our that, our comic book shops. all of that sort of thing, but both distributed fundraising and direct fundraising with book sales and such. That's our core business. So advertising has proven to be a limiter in people coming freely to our websites because they're like, what is this pop-up? What is this malicious ad? I don't want anything to do with this. Delete, 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 back out, back out, back out. So we've removed that because you want to remove all the barriers for entry of new people finding Brad Geiger and falling in love with Brad Geiger's work. And ads do that. They are a limiter in who will go and how much they'll come back to your site.
I'm so glad you mentioned that, Dave, because that was the other point that I was going to make is that, okay, we've made the point firmly that we're not running a business model that has anything to do with Netflix, right? We're not licensing other people's work. We're not funding productions, and we've got nothing to do with Netflix. But here's the other side of that coin. Advertising on websites has not changed in that time, right? Malicious advertising is still out there. Overly aggressive advertising is still out there. The CPM, the cost per thousands of ad views that you're earning is still in the cellar. It's a rock bottom amount of money that you're making for ads, right? All of the things that we left advertising because of still exist. Oh, and don't forget ad blockers. Those didn't go anywhere.
All the savviest readers have an ad blocker. So the people the advertisers most want to reach, they can't reach. So it's still very much a broken ecosystem. Yeah.
And so there's no part of that that's worth going back to. In fact, what happened when we finally left advertising? Well, our sites got faster. They loaded quicker. We were able to do more clear messaging because we were able to put our house ads on. Well, I still use that space. I just use it to promote things that I'm doing, like Patreon and books and ebooks and so forth. I use that space. I didn't have an email pop up one morning at random saying, hey, I just went to your site and it downloaded a virus onto my computer. How do I get it off? And now, Brad, it's your problem to solve that I've got this virus. Those problems disappeared. I didn't have aggressive advertising pop up and jump up in front of my comic as somebody was trying to read it. Oh, and by the way, just a quick aside, those of you who are doing the exact same thing with your email newsletter where it pops up in front of your comic when I'm trying to read it, you guys are shooting yourself in the foot or maybe a few feet higher. You're shooting yourself between the eyes. Every time one of those things come up that says, hey, join my Substack, as I'm trying to see what's on your website, I'm out. Nothing's worth that kind of aggravation. I didn't even know if your comic was going to be funny in the first place. And now you got things popping in front of me. Out. That was set up. There's a reason, by the way, that's a push button decision you made. And that push button decision is made for completely different applications than you. It's made for websites that are doing different things than you. You got to see that. You got to understand it. But that's a tangent. Those pop-ups drive me crazy. But those aggressive advertisements, that they come in and they're going to pop up there. They're going to create that same kind of you want us to go back. You think that's worth going back to? My life got 100% better when I took the ads off of there. Netflix can do whatever they want to do. And by the way, so can the Ford Motor Company. So can the post office. I don't know who else you're comparing yourself to. Marvel Comics can do whatever they want. Has nothing to do with the business that I'm in.
I want to congratulate you because the next time I'm at a pool type environment with you, I want to see how long you can stay underwater, because for a good 3 minutes there, you didn't take a breath. That was one run-on sentence, and there was no breathing. I invite everyone to rewind and listen to that diatribe again. You will not hear an intake of oxygen for Brad's lungs for a solid 3 minutes.
Oh my God.
Brad, have you considered diving for pearls? Because you have the lung capacity, my friend. Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we've recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics.
So I wanted to do an update, Brad, on Patreon again this week. We talked about a little bit about their changes, about their beautiful new logo, which no one has any critiques for. It is unquestionably... It's unquestionably one of the best logos we've ever seen. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about something that we didn't really go deep on last week, which is that Patreon has now combined paying patrons, which they now call members, with free followers, which are now called free members, if I have my terminology right. So super easy to understand. No confusion there. But here's the thing. So this is not, as of this recording, this is not something that you can opt out of. You will now have free members, and they will be displayed with your paying members. You can opt out of the visibility of the option to choose a free membership. And I have done that on Drive and on Sheldon and on ComicLab with Brad. And I think you've done it on Evil Inc., haven't you, Brad?
I'm just checking, but I believe I have. I think I did that a long time ago.
Anyway, I think Brad and I would recommend to everyone that they turn off that visibility for a bunch of reasons that we'll talk about. But anyway, Brad, I realized why Patreon is now combining paid patrons with our freeloading BS free members. And here's the thing. I get it that they want to become kind of a social media feed for artists a bunch of, because social media is failing so much. I can see a business argument for that happening, right? But it's not the core reason why Patreon exists. It's like Kickstarter saying, we can kickstart projects, but we also do amazing plumbing on the side. So if you need a plumber, Kickstarter's your gang, right? Patreon is now saying, we allow for distributed fundraising on a repetitive basis of artists on an ongoing basis. But we also do social media. And you're like, oh, all right, well, what are we now? And so what ends up happening is this big confuzzled messaging that's happening. But I realized why I think they're doing this. I have no way of justifying that this is the actual case, but I think I know why they're doing this. I think they need to fudge their overall user numbers for their VC money or their angel investors or whatever it is, to say, look, see all the progress we're making? See how big the user base is? It's like when Facebook used to lie to collegehumor.com about how many views their videos were getting, because you need to lie to certain people to get them to. And I feel like this is a little bit fudging the numbers for Patreon. I have no evidence that this is the case, but I feel like this is what's happening, Brad, is that we've always said the piper will come, the payment will come due at some point, and I feel like it maybe is starting to come due for that amazing amount of VC money that Patreon took in.
Right. In other words, they're starting to bend to the pressure.
Yes. That perhaps VC. This is the beginning of an enshittification process for Patreon, because the money is starting to demand a return. And that first inkling of that might be, oh, look at how high our user numbers are. It's not that Brad Geiger has 1,000 patrons. Now Brad has 3,500 patrons, even though it's still only 1,000 paying patrons, right?
Yeah, and even though it's only 1,000 that matter.
Right.
Well, we've got two subtopics here that need to be addressed. Number one is enshittification, right? Is this, in fact, we've already gotten a number of people who have written into the show saying, is this the enshittification of Patreon? And the other one that I think we should take first is this whole idea of free members. What kind of problems is that going to cause potentially, even though we should say from the outset, they've always been there, right? It's just that we used to call them followers.
Right.
And we've had pro tips that had suggestions on how you can implement followers in your Patreon strategy. So it's not actually anything new. The new part is now they're being included in your public facing numbers. But in terms of them being there, they've always been there. I wonder whether they know that they were there, and I wonder whether a lot of us know that they were there.
I certainly didn't. As much as was possible, I tried to ignore that whole aspect of Patreon. I really did. And previously, Patreon allowed everybody involved to ignore it: the users, the patrons, and the creator, right?
Right.
But now it's front and center. And what's worse about it is because these numbers are publicly being reported on your facing public page, that also means that your Graphtreon numbers are now being completely broken.
Yeah.
And for those not familiar with it, Patreon has terrible analytics. For a company that should be offering you amazing, in-depth, down to the detail, granular analytics about who's coming, where they're coming from, how long they're staying, how much they're paying, what triggered them leaving. You don't get those analytics. You have to go to Graphtreon instead of Patreon, right? And they were scraping all the public numbers and making really usable daily updates of Patreon. Patreon gives you this weird sort of mean average for the month, or I don't even know what number it's like it's some average or median or mean of over a given time period. Not as helpful in terms of like, Brad wants to know, if I make XYZ post on this location, did I get more that day? Well, you go over to the Patreon's analytics and it's this weird smoothed out number. You have no idea, or on a day-to-day basis, if the thing that you tried worked, but you do if you go over to Graphtreon, or at least until they started this bullshit thing of mixing the free members with the paid members, and now your numbers are nonsense.
Yeah, and I think I think we're going to have to take our own advice on this a little bit, in that I've said for a long time, to really know how Patreon works, you need to be a Patreon backer of a few other people so you can experience it from the user side. And I think we're just going to have to become free members of a few people to see how Patreon is actually handling free members. Because you said this pre-show, where you said, I'm worried about the free members, that they're going to get a skewed vision of what Patreon is, because I'm not posting to free members. I'm not posting to that level. So if they become a member at the free level and I don't post anything, they're just going to wander away. And because they're going to be like, well, Dave doesn't engage, so I'm not going to be here. So I think we're going to have to just start experimenting for ourselves to see, how is that user experience? B, if you do post things to that level, and I've got some ideas on how to do that. If you're going to post at that level, does Patreon then, on its user experience, does it say, hey, you got this post, and to get even more, you can join at the $2 level and get XYZ? In other words, walk them up the ladder. And if that happens, then I can see a point.
Maybe.
But for example, I'll give you an example how I think we could use a post for free members. And I do this from time to time. In fact, I think I might start doing it on ComicLab, but just as an example, anytime I do a special offer or there's a special bonus, and I would also put into this category when we put out the notice that it's time to submit your questions at the $5 level for the show. That goes out in a direct message to our users, but I also do a post on Patreon saying that the messages went out, just in case people don't have their notifications set right or something like that. They can find out that the notifications have sent out, and this is how the proper way for them to submit their questions so we can stay organized.
Right.
I can see that notification post being a free post because, and by the way, I do the same thing when I do a special offer. I do a notification post saying, if you go to your Patreon messages, you've got a download code for this e-comic. And then I do a post on Patreon saying, hey, all of the download codes have gone out. This is what you need to know. This is how you get a download code, et cetera, et cetera. That's another post that I could see being a free member post, because what it's basically saying is there's stuff going on here that you're missing out on. Right? I'm not posting anything really meaningful. I'm certainly not posting content there, but I am posting something there that says there's stuff going on here, and if you'd like to participate, here's what you need to do.
Yeah, and I think that Brad's advice is solid there. I think that's a good way to react to that. I will offer a different way to react to this new free membership, which is what?
I know. Well, no, I'll give you a different way to react to it. You take a hammer to it and you don't stop until
I'll
it's
give
in
you
pieces.
a different way to react to it. You go to hell, free membership. You go to hell and you die. No, I honestly, my reaction to this is the way that I would react to some other past Patreon moves, which is to recognize that this is a move not for your benefit, but for Patreon's benefit, and you don't have to bite down on the fishhook, right? Merch for members, great for Patreon's bottom line, terrible for your bottom line. Don't do it. I'm trying to think of other things. Video uploads, great for Patreon's bottom line eventually, not good for your bottom line. Don't do it. And so
chat's another one.
Yeah.
Chat was great for Patreon. We found out very quickly our backers were not interested in it.
Again, Patreon has been life-changing for my business. I am grateful to Patreon. I am so thankful that it exists and that its core function does what it does. I love Patreon. I do not need to go at all into this free membership nonsense. It's not what I need from Patreon. Patreon's core job is to take my existing audience that I've cultivated online, on social media, on my website, in real life, and then to translate that into ongoing, socially distributed, boy, that's a good word.
Distributed.
That's almost English. To translate that into ongoing community distributed fundraising that supports my art at a small, manageably sized payment that people can make, for which they get a bunch of value because they've unlocked a bunch of stuff on Patreon and on my website because of their membership, right? That's what I want. And so I don't need to go at all into this free membership. I think I'm going to ignore it. And frankly, I will give everyone the advice that we often give when Patreon makes a stumble, which is give it 3 to 4 weeks. I think Patreon will find that this is not working for people. They don't want it. They don't need it. And fairly soon, I'm virtually certain, Brad, fairly soon we will see buttons in the settings of Patreons that says turn off free membership or turn off the visibility of free. I mean, we already see turn off the visibility, but turn off free membership, allow for free members, that kind of thing, because just that step alone wipes away this problem. If I don't have to think about free membership, great. Other people can use it. Go with God. It's not a good idea, I don't think, but go for it. I will not be using it.
Right. Okay. So there's two. Here's the second thing that I think that we need to talk about. Is this, and because it's come up a lot, is this the enshittification of Patreon? And that goes back to Cory Doctorow doing a very, very thoughtful and thought-provoking post. And by the way, his new book is very good. I'll suggest reading that as well. Cory's new book is excellent. But it says a lot of these social media platforms, a lot of payment platforms like Kickstarter, Patreon, and so forth have an enshittification process where first it's really good for the user, then it's really good for the businesses that are trying to sell things to that user base that is created. And then finally, it's good only for the platform itself, and it tries to claw back all of that value that it created in the first two passes. And people are sending questions into the show saying, is this the enshittification of Patreon? And the answer is, I don't know. But I will tell you this. Our good friends, Jonathan and Elizabeth over at War and Peas, sent over a video that there was this very intelligent sounding guy with a British accent that had a very long video that was a video essay talking about why this is the fall of Patreon. And I disagreed with almost everything this person said. His opening salvo, Dave, was that they got rid of milestone rewards, and that was a big mistake. Well, we've already talked about on the show. Yeah. We went deep on why getting milestone awards, getting rid of those was a good idea.
Yeah,
it was a sign of the evolution of Patreon. And as soon as he did that, Dave, as soon as he said that getting rid of milestone rewards was bad, I couldn't take anything that he said seriously after that, because in my mind, this guy really doesn't understand what Patreon is. And if he's got opinions after that, that's up to him. But I can't take him seriously. And it's not my job to explain Patreon to this guy. But going down the path, what if, you got to ask the question, what if this is the fall of Patreon? What if this is the enshittification of Patreon? What if it's the case? Well, the case, if that's the case, then that's really sad. And I'll be heartbroken if Patreon has come to an end. Absolutely. Because like Dave said, Patreon changed our lives. It's changed the lives of a lot of creators. And here's the important thing. Patreon changed all those lives by instituting this idea that subscribing to content was safe, cool, and fun. And before Patreon, there wasn't a whole lot of people subscribing to content that comic creators made. They would maybe subscribe to different types of content like that they were getting. But this was a new thing for us. And it made it cool. It gave the idea of exclusivity, exclusive rewards, subscriptions. It started all of that stuff. And if it ends, then I'm very sad. However, the idea that it started will live on. We already know that there are half a dozen, maybe a dozen or more Patreon clones out there trying to get some of that business that Patreon started, trying to be Patreon, trying to duplicate what Patreon did. And if Patreon goes down the enshittification route, it's dead. But the idea lives on.
Right.
The idea of subscribing to content, the idea of producing exclusive content that people want to interact with, that idea goes on. And that's the important thing. The important thing is the idea, not the company.
Exactly. It's not like this is the Library of Alexandria, and if it burns down, you lose all the plays of Aristophanes. Like the idea of Patreon, of distributed fundraising on an ongoing basis is out there now. And in fact, there's like 30 companies, some of which are gigantic companies, actively trying to work it into their system. So we'll find a way to do it. Will it be a painful 6 to 18 months of adoption? Yes, it will be.
Yes.
But if you're following our advice, do you have other legs under the table of your career than just Patreon? Yes, you've got Kickstarter, you've got book sales, you've got merch sales, you've got Comic-Cons, you've got all sorts of other things that you're doing to keep those legs under the table so that if Patreon goes down, it's not going to bring you down. But like Brad, I don't think we're there yet where the enshittification will knock them over. I think, I think they're going to course correct whatever mistakes they're making here. And I think largely, I think we're going to be fine within 6 months of this complaint, you know?
Yeah. Well, speaking of that conversation I had with our friends at War and Peas, they taught me a new word called doom slinging. Right? When you basically something happens and it's just everybody on social media is like, oh, this is doom. It's all ashes and woe. This is horrible. They're slinging doom. And if you remember, we've been down this road before with Patreon. In fact, every time Patreon announces a major change, there's somebody doing a video that says it's the end of Patreon. It's all done. It's horrible. And then guess what happens? Nothing. Then we go on and then there's another change and it's all ashes and woe again.
And so keep in mind the spirit Brad's just saying is that don't be talking to your readers saying, oh no, Patreon has ruined everything. Because then you cannot turn around and go, and by the way, join me on Patreon. You can't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, the critiques that Brad and I have here on this podcast are sort of within the family. It's like, because we're all cartoonists and we're talking about this is what we're saying. But the truth is 99% of what people want from Patreon is still fine. So don't go being a doom slinger publicly, because all the same people that said ash and woe, oh no, Kickstarter is going to allow AI, therefore I'm never using Kickstarter, neither should you. The only person you're hurting in that moment is you. You're not going to ding Kickstarter at all.
You're also hurting me. And that's why I really want you to stop it, because when you're out there panicking on social media, not only are you making it hard for you to get your next Patreon backer, you're making it hard for me to get my next Patreon backer. And I need you to settle the fuck down. Because all this doom and gloom and all of this panic is spooking the people that we want to be our patrons and our customers and our clients. I need you to calm down. I need you to act like a professional, for Christ's sake. When I see this fucking panic on every time Patreon makes a move and there's panic, you're not only hurting yourself, you're hurting me and everybody else that's out there trying to make a living. You need to settle down.
Yeah, boy, and I loved that level of vitriol that came out at the end there. That was great. Yeah. Oh boy,
I'm serious. Hey, speaking of vitriol,
well, I tell you what, it takes Grandpa a minute to get out of his chair, but once you get him up out of that easy chair, the cane starts flying.
Yeah, well, listen, I'm going to get your ire up now. I'm going to get you going because I know you got a message from KDP putting you right in your place. What did Amazon have to say to you?
Okay, so as an update for everybody from last week or 2 weeks show ago, if you remember, the really kind folks at Andrews McMeel and Brent Bartram specifically at Andrews McMeel had recommended that we jump into the KDP, Kindle Direct Publishing, and specifically Kindle Direct Publishing Unlimited with our ebooks as a way of making an additional couple hundreds to perhaps over $1,000 a month in very passive income, right? So Brad and I are like, hey, let's try it. And so as a first test case, I upload one of my books this week, as does Brad. We stay on FaceTime. We talk each other through the process where we're working our way through it. We submit the book. Kindle comes back to me a week later and says, hey, because you get 3 categories you can put your book in, right? So in my case with Anatomy of Dinosaurs, I did one like children's book, science-based dinosaurs, right? That was one of my themes. Another one was like children's books, humor, comics, right? That was another one. Right. And I got this note back from Kindle saying, hey, these are not comics. And at first I was trying to be just kind of even keel about it. Like, oh, well, I understand the potential critique. But much like Gary Larson's The Far Side or every political cartoon or Ziggy or The Family Circus or every cartoon that's ever been in The New Yorker, this is a single image without word balloons presented with humorous text nearby. And that is considered a comic. Kindle comes back again saying, we reviewed this. This is not a comic. At this point, I didn't want to be uppity about it, but I was like, motherfucker, I have 2 master's degrees in the history of comics. I did a feature documentary, which won at San Diego Comic-Con on comics. I wrote a how-to book on comics. I've done 6 years of a weekly podcast on comics. Son of a bitch, this is comics. Don't tell me that this is not comics. And I wanted to be so small, but then Brad's like, Dave, you realize you're talking to artificial intelligence. You're not talking to a human in this email. And I was like, oh my God, Brad, you're right. I'm not talking to a human being. Vanessa is AI. I was not talking to an actual Vanessa.
You're never talking to a person when you're dealing with Amazon. That would mean they'd have to pay people. They don't have any. You know, when we were kids and they told us these science fiction stories about the robots taking over, right? And they were going to take over and they were going to step on us and they were going to shoot us with laser beams and they were going to make life miserable. Well, they got the last part right. Everything else is wrong. The robots are taking over and our lives are miserable, but there's no laser beams. Nobody's getting stepped on. We're just going to get annoyed to death because all this stuff is super annoying. And you know that if you could talk to a person, you could get it straightened up in a minute. You could completely get this done, but you'll never, ever get a chance to talk to a person. And all you're going to do is get this thing that's going to keep spitting out these pre-formatted replies that have nothing at all to do with what you're trying to talk about.
Like as soon as Brad told me, Dave, you're talking to an AI, you're not talking to a human. I was like, okay, now as an intelligent person, what string of words do I have to put together that would magically unlock the algorithm of that AI saying no to a thing, right? Yeah. You know what I mean? Like, what is it? And what I eventually landed on, and I figured it out, that the AI is specifically critical of the fact that it's non-sequential comics, right? It's not a panel following another panel, which someone at Amazon has programmed the AI to think that is what a comic is. A comic is 2 sequential panels following one another, and most likely one of them has a word balloon. So if you have a single panel comic with nearby text that's jokey and there's no word balloons, Amazon is like, that's an illustration. That's a kid's illustration. That's not a comic. And you're like, oh, God bless America. That is a comic, you know?
Yeah. No, I mean, listen, I tell you what, if you want, I'll tell you what you need to tell Vanessa. You need to tell, here's what you need to tell Vanessa.
What string of words do I need to tell Vanessa, Brad?
Here's what just next time you're talking to Vanessa, pull her aside and say, listen, Vanessa, C:// J button hello equals new J button, open parentheses, quote, hello, unquote, close parentheses, new J frame, // semicolon, J frame, container panel equals frame dot get content panel. And she'll understand. Then she'll say,
get it.
comics? Love them. You're in, Dave. You're in.
David, has been a pleasure talking to you.
I've got bad news for you, Dave. I as we were talking, did you see this button just came up? Our show is now, the ComicLab podcast is on Audible, which is also a Amazon.com company.
Okay.
We just got a note from Audible. I think here, I'm going to push the button. And it's a voicemail we got from Audible about our podcast.
Oh, okay,
I'm going to click the button.
Here.
Click.
Dear ComicLab, you are not a podcast. This is an information display of words regarding something related to comics, but not comics. Have a nice day. This has been Vanessa.
Click. See what I mean? It's happening all over. The robots are taking over. Wasn't that a great joke?
All right, let me jump us into our next question over at patreon.com/ComicLab, which you will join by Thanksgiving to get those 2 episodes of Drunk and Drunker Comic Lab. This comes in from Robert Clemens over at patreon.com/ComicLab. And Robert writes, "Hey, Brad and Dave, this is Rob. Thinking back to the Thanos Snap episode." And Brad, you remember that one. After Brad and Dave meet again for the first time, do they start a new podcast together? Given all the advice you've given, not once have you said start a podcast or pursue alternate media projects. So would you do it? And Brad, before you answer that, I just want to remind everybody that Thanos episode, in case you didn't hear it, was the conceit was Brad and I have all of our talents, all of our knowledge of comics, all of our 25 years of experience, but a Thanos snap has taken away our career. And how would we restart from scratch with all the skill sets that we have, right? That was the basic of that episode. But now, Brad, given that Thanos snap conditions, would you start a podcast? Would we start a podcast?
I love it when this happens, because what's happening here is almost all of our answers to the questions and the issues that have come up in this episode have a theme, right? And the theme is know what business you're in.
Yes.
That was our opening question about Netflix. It's really the heart of what's going on with Patreon, right? Trying to be social media. We want them to know what business.
Oh my God,
in.
that's exactly true. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's the answer for this. The answer is, would Dave and Brad do a podcast? No, probably not. And because here's why. We don't suggest doing a podcast as a way to help your webcomics business or to help your webcomic, because that's not why we do it. We don't do this podcast because it helps us in our business, because the effect on our business is negligible. In fact, it's more negative than positive. You could argue, oh yeah, we've got an increased visibility because of the podcast. But I could also argue that the time that I put into the podcast would be much better spent put into Evil Inc.
Yeah.
And same thing for Dave.
Yeah.
The time that he spends on the podcast would be much better put into Evil Inc. And so for both of us, it's a push, and at best negative at worst. We don't do this podcast because it's a good business move at all.
Yeah. And so would we ever do a podcast? I'll tell you when. Once we had gotten established, the income streams were flowing. We had a lot of legs under the table. Again, Patreon, Kickstarter, books, comic shows, appearances, book signings, all this and that. A lot of legs under the table in terms of income streams. Then it would probably be a repeat of what happened to us the first time around, which caused us to do this show the first time, which is a lot of people start to email you and go, how are you doing this? How are you making this work? Right. Yeah. That is how we got started, Brad. If you remember, is people are like, wait, how are you making, you're just sharing comics online and you're making a living from that? How does that work? Think about every party you ever go to with other parents or other social setting. And they're like, really? You give away your comics for free and that generates a career? How? So we actually found that this podcast was kind of an efficiency move in terms of sharing and paying forward what we'd learned, good and bad, in terms of trying to structure this kind of a career. And frankly, it's a love of comics that now that Brad and I have established our career, trying to send the ladder back down, saying, listen, don't go with a book publisher. Don't go with Marvel or DC. Do it yourself. Own and control your own business. Make your own magic. And here's the tools you can use to make that happen.
Right.
And so listen, not to blow up our own egos, but I think there's a sense of trying to give back with this show, don't you think? But it's not necessarily a career booster.
No, it's about mentorship. It's about sharing information. None of this was a smart business move. You know?
Yeah. No, having said that, it's not like this is. I also don't want to claim that this is purely altruistic. We do a Patreon. We have sponsors. We're not dummies. Like if we're doing this on a weekly basis, we try to at least somewhat underwrite the costs involved of having an editor and doing all this and that and the time expenditures. Right. And that's fine. But as to Brad's point, I probably would be better off if I did in the hour and a half to 2 hours that we spend, or maybe closer to 3 hours now that I think about it, 3 hours that we spend on ComicLab every week. If I did an eBay piece for Drive every week with those 3 hours, I would make more money, is the honest to God truth. Yeah. So in that respect, it kind of is altruistic, but it's also fun to do. I mean, we enjoy doing it. Yeah.
we don't want to make it too dour. I mean, part of it is an awful lot of fun getting on a microphone with one of my very closest friends and screwing around for a week or an hour. But having said that, as much fun as I have had screwing around for an hour, it is time for us to say that you've been listening to ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my friend Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc. at evilcomic.com.
And my friend Dave Kellett, the co-director of the comics documentary Stripped, and the cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
All of which, according to Vanessa, are not comics. None of those are comics. The feature film Stripped, not about comics, apparently. Sheldon, I don't know what that's about. Apparently that's about family relationships. Drive, some sort of sci-fi novel nonsense. There's not a graphic novel in there. Anyway, ComicLab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net, and this episode was edited by Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love ComicLab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a future episode like this one. Dave, this wonderful 5-star review just came in on Apple Podcasts. This is from Vanessa, who says, "Still not a podcast, assholes."
Oh, wow. Huge thanks and a shout out to Vanessa on that one. I will say ComicLab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/ComicLab. So before Thanksgiving, you are going to go join us because this is, honest to God, right. I'm not over exaggerating. This is the 2 funniest hours we've ever recorded. And so I will go ahead and say that twice. Patreon.com/ComicLab.
I've got bad news for you, Dave. I as we were talking, did you see this button just came up? Our show is now, the ComicLab podcast is on Audible, which is also a Amazon.com company. Okay. We just got a note from Audible. I think here, I'm going to push the button. And it's a voicemail we got from Audible about our podcast.
Oh,
here,
okay,
I'm going to click the button.
Here.
Click. This is your cue, Dave. This is.
Oh, wait, what? What? How is that my cue?
We talked about this before the show. Now you're going to do the computer voice that says, "Attention, ComicLab listeners, you are not a podcast." You had the punchline.
Oh,
do you remember doing this?
Brad, you forget that your dear friend has had a stroke. And so I forgot the whole joke setup for that. No, you're right. Yeah. No,
so now we'll cut this all part out and you just come in and say, "You're not a podcast." Okay. That's the punchline.
Okay, here we go.